Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. In addition to me being on today's webinar, we also have Lula Ficadu, PJ Lepp, and Phoebe Nesseth, who are on the call. So if any questions come up, they may be able to help answer them. I might look to them to answer some of them. So we're talking about the 2020 Legislative Action Committee appointment process. And this is the appointment process to appoint delegates to the Legislative Action Committees. And what I'll talk about today are typical circumstances. Some Legislative Action Committees have a few nuances to these guidelines and circumstances, but I'm going to talk about generally how things work so that hopefully this is a good overview for everyone. First, I'm going to talk about the Legislative Action Committees, the appointment process, the term requirements, the rules that govern these LAC structures, what's expected or what the role is of the chapter executive director, financials, and some resources that we have on our end to share with legislative action committees. So as you see here, there are 36 legislative action committees. You'll see on this slide the states that are colored in blue have legislative action committees. And if we don't have a legislative action committee, by the way, we're still tracking legislation in every single state throughout the country. And if something comes up, we do work with our members on grassroots efforts to try to impact that legislation, whether it's kill a bill or support a bill. We do end up working with members in that state. These are legislative action committees. The term actually begins October 1st, 2020, and it goes through September 30th, the 2 years later, right? So we have, when we do our LAC nominations, chapters make nominations to the legislative action committees. And the goal of the process is to make sure we have broad representation of the industry and of our membership categories on the Legislative Action Committee. There are a couple of, like I said, we have some guidelines, right? The LAC operational guidelines. I'm going to show you a link to those guidelines in a little bit. But those guidelines define how we do the appointment process. Now, the chapters appoint delegates to the LAC. And there are a couple of common guidelines that we need to continually enforce that come up often, that become a question for either the chapter or the Legislative Action Committee. And an example of those is one, no LAC member may serve more than 5 consecutive terms. And this is becoming important right now because we just put this into place 8 years ago, I think, right, Lula? So 10 years is the term, will term out a Legislative Action Committee member. So if someone has turned, so we just started that, most people who are running up against this deadline will hit this after this appointment process. So, and we have some Legislative Action Committees where a significant number of the LAC members will term out. What we're suggesting is, as you're looking at this process now, that you consider bringing in new folks right now to this process. And if you have some of those folks who are going to term out next term, maybe they take a break now. So maybe 1 or 2 or 3 of them take 1 term off, and then they can be reappointed in the future. You just want to make sure that we're staggering some of the institutional knowledge we have on these legislative action committees. Also, so the term clock, as Lula notes here, begins 2012. So that means 2022, somebody may be running up against that 10-year term limit. So the appointment process. Chapters appoint delegates, and the Legislative Action Committee can appoint delegates as well. If you're in a state that has more than 1 chapter, then your chapter appoints 2 members. If you're just 1 chapter in a state, let's see, I'm going to look at a list and see if we have anybody. Alabama, perfect example. So Alabama then has 6 appointees to the LAC. We can have up to 20 members on a Legislative Action Committee. So after the chapter appointment process, and I see we have some people on from California. Hi, Steve. Hi, Elisa. In California, it's a great example of how the appointment process works. So each chapter appoints 2 people, and then the LAC can also add people up to 20. So there are 2 different ways for individuals to be appointed to the LAC, but we still need to have the balance of representation. So chapters need to work together on the appointment process and also work with us. So LUL is really great at working with chapters in states with multiple chapters to make sure that we have the right balance of members represented on the Legislative Action Committee. This link right here is a link to the LAC operational guidelines. There are two areas where we have to, that we really try to work together with the chapters to make sure that we comply, that the chapters and the LACs comply with these requirements. And it's under number 2 and number 3 on this particular slide. So number 2, no membership category shall have more than a majority on the Legislative Action Committee. So that means we can't have, if you have an 11-person Legislative Action Committee, you cannot have more than 6 managers, 6 attorneys, 6 homeowner leaders on that Legislative Action Committee. You cannot have a majority of one membership category. And when we talk about membership categories, it's pretty clear. It's managers, homeowner leaders, and business partners. So no one of those 3 groups can have a majority. So even if it's business partners, if you have a mix of insurance, landscape, attorney, you still can't have more than 6 on that 11-person Legislative Action Committee. The second one that does sometimes come up that needs to be addressed is no more than 1 person per company, per membership category can serve on a LAC. And I'm going to pick on first service and associate for this. So, and I'm going to pick on law firms as well, because that's where we see this happening. So let's say there is in your in your state, you have a manager who works for a company, and during their term, they become acquired by an associate company, and you already have someone on the Legislative Action Committee working for another associate company. This happens in some of the larger states, especially where there's a big geographic area. That can't happen. So what we do in those circumstances, if people are serving their terms and a merger happens, whether it's a management company or a law firm that creates a problem with this particular guideline, we let those 2 members serve out their term, but by the end of the term, the situation needs to be resolved so that then no more than 1 member per membership per company can serve on the Legislative Action Committee.
Hey, Dawn.
Yeah.
We have a question in the chat box related to the membership categories. Melanie in the Rocky Mountain chapter is asking whose responsibility it is to ensure the membership category representation is not exceeding the majority.
That's a great question. Thanks for asking that question. We ask the chapters to work together. Now, but ultimately, we make sure it doesn't happen. So what happens is we'll get the delegates from the Rocky Mountain chapter, we'll get the delegates from the Southern Colorado chapter, and they'll also go into the Legislative Action Committee. And then hopefully everybody's working together to this point, and by the time they come to us, oftentimes, it's different. I will say it's different in every state. Sometimes there's one chapter that kind of takes the lead and gets things organized. Sometimes it's that Legislative Action Committee that takes the lead and gets things organized. But when it comes to us, if one of these 2 guidelines is not working, if there is maybe an issue with it, then we go back to the chapters and the Legislative Action Committee to resolve it. So it's different in every circumstance. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the role of the primary role of the chapter executive director. And this is in the LAC, in the delegate appointment process. And then I just added a few things beyond that. But really, we're talking today about the delegate appointment process. So the chapter board must approve the delegates that are being appointed by the chapter. And so it's up to the chapter executive director to work with the chapter on those appointments. Now, what I've seen, so I was a chapter executive director in Arizona and the Washington Metro chapter. And I'll tell you, this may resonate with some of you. When I started in Arizona, I was super young, and I didn't know what the LAC was. And first of all, everyone kept calling it a LAC. So if you hear me say Legislative Action Committee and LAC, it's because it made me crazy that I didn't know what LAC was for 6 months probably. So when I learned about the Legislative Action Committee appointment process, I went to the chapter board, and the chapter board said, oh, that's the LAC, they'll handle it. So I went to the Legislative Action Committee, and they were like, yeah, you don't need to do anything. These are the 6 people that should be appointed, and just give that to National. And I was like, oh, okay. So that's what I did. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I realized, like, wait a second, this says that the chapter board is supposed to approve it, and there should be a conversation. And also, I loved my folks in Arizona, but what they were used to doing on a regular basis was, don't worry about it, Dawn. You don't even have to be involved. You actually don't even have to be on our calls. And they wanted to be able to reserve my time for conferences and events and things like that. But what's so important is that chapter executive directors are engaged with the Legislative Action Committee. You know what's going on. And what's really important is the chapter board feels very comfortable with their delegates, that their delegates are the ones they think are going to be best for the association, to be able to advocate in the best interest of the members, that they'll be able to, maybe they have connections with some of the politicians, some of the legislators. They're good communicators to the Legislative Action Committee and back to the chapter. So those delegates are really, really important. They're an important link between the chapter and the Legislative Action Committee, and to our office as well. So this process is important, and it's much more important today than when I first started with the Central Arizona chapter, because back then, 20 plus years ago, there weren't as many bills that were being introduced impacting associations. There weren't as many people living in associations, not the percentage that we have today, and just things were just much different. So we now have a lot of bills out there, and there's a lot of, this is the area of government and public affairs is a significant piece of the membership value that we offer to our members. So we as chapter executive directors need to be able to communicate that to our members. So it's really important that this process is working well. And in some states, it works beautifully. In other states, there still are these issues where all parties don't think the other party needs to be involved. But I'm here to tell you we're better together, and we're always better working more collaboratively, and we're always better working with more communication, especially back to our members on some of these important issues. So the chapter executive director works with the Legislative Action Committee to let them know they're going to be appointing delegates. I think it's very appropriate for the chapter executive director to know those chapter delegates and to work with the board to see if those are the same delegates that you will want to be appointing for this year, or if there are others that should be appointed. Some chapters, and I'll pick on the Central Oregon chapter and Idaho chapter. Heather, I think, is on the call. She did a call out to the membership saying, hey, here's an application. We'd love to know if you're interested in serving on the Legislative Action Committee, so that the board has people to kind of look at and people to consider when they're making the appointment process. So if you need tools for that, we have some sample applications, self-nomination forms that you can send out to your membership. And oftentimes people just know some of the best people to work on legislative action committees are people who have been very involved, who have demonstrated an understanding of our policy issues, understanding of our issues, and again, who may be really well connected with legislators as well. So that chapter executive director makes sure that the process is started, the process is going, and the board is looking at applicants. And then, of course, make sure that the board votes on those delegates before the deadline. When?
September 15th.
September 15th, right. So all of those those delegate approvals by the board need to be completed by September 15th. That means this month is your month, right? This month or early next month, when you have your board meeting, you should be approving a slate of delegates. And then, of course, your role as chapter execs and board presidents is to keep engaged with the Legislative Action Committee. I would suggest that you have a standing agenda item on your board meeting agenda that requires or allows for a report from one or more of your chapter delegates who serve on the Legislative Action Committee. So you know what's going on. Now listen, if the legislative session is not up, is adjourned and the delegates aren't doing anything, the LACs aren't doing anything at that particular time, there may be no report, which is fine. But I would say keep it on there, because otherwise you may forget to have it on during really important times when board conversation about some of these policy issues can be important. Participate in LAC meetings, and then really importantly, communicate what the LAC is doing with members, whether it's at your luncheons, which I hope we have a lot of those in 2021, conferences, and just in your, if you have a weekly email, your newsletters, your web page. We do have a web page because each Legislative Action Committee has a page on our website. And they'll send out the landing page and you'll be able to go to your Legislative Action Committee, link that page to your web page to help demonstrate the value. Any questions?
You had mentioned having the executive director included in all the communication, and I think that's where we really struggle. We're often told by the LAC that they're working on strategy and that it's confidential. And then if you can speak to that a little bit, and also
Sure.
whose responsibility it is to communicate with members. That's probably where our other big struggle is wanting to put out more communication to the membership about what's going on as bills are presented and things, and the LAC being, in our opinion, very hesitant to do that. So can you talk a little bit about those kinds of issues?
Yeah, yes, Alicia, thank you so much for bringing up those issues. So regarding the first issue was participating in meetings. So sometimes the Legislative Action Committee might have a small group that works on something before it ever goes to the full Legislative Action Committee, and they may be talking about something that is sensitive that would benefit from being a discussion of a smaller group, which is fine. I don't see any reason a chapter executive director can't be part of those conversations. At the same time, I don't know that it is critical that the chapter executive director be involved in all of those conversations. What is important in every single Legislative Action Committee meeting, that things are being voted on, those should be open to the chapter executive director, chapter president, and the chapter delegates should be asked to report back to the chapter on all of those meeting activities. So I do know what you're talking about with the with the Colorado LAC. They do keep things very tight. And part of that is because there are other CAI members that don't fully support. There's a lot of there's a lack of consensus in our industry in Colorado. And so when the Legislative Action Committee is trying to do something, there's a fear that other companies that are CAI members might find out about it and hurt our efforts. So that happens, but that to me is a sign of a larger issue, right? So keeping a tight conversation and strategy because you're afraid of our own members means there probably needs to be some conversations to build consensus with our membership. So there needs to be more open conversation. And I will tell you also, Alicia, we as an industry have been transitioning from being, we are so criticized, right? Homeowners associations, we see in the media, terrible, that this association did this terrible thing, this association did that terrible thing. And even sometimes our own members will say, oh, you know, the HOA board that I work with is exhausting. I have to take my Tums to a meeting or I'm gonna have like heartburn. Well, there's this negativity, and we as an organization, or we as an industry, have sometimes apologized for our clients, apologized for who we are. And there's a shift now in, we shouldn't do that. We should be proud of who we are. We should be absolutely proud of our public policies. We should be proud of our industry. I am so proud, especially looking at how association boards and managers have handled this pandemic, where everyone has gone home. It's remarkable. So some of our legislative action committees have thought it very important to keep things really tight so that nothing gets out. I think we need to have broad conversations and stand on top of buildings and be very proud of what our policies are. We don't have to share our strategies from the top of the building, because sometimes we need to, we go up against very powerful lobbies, the realtors, the bankers, the developers, and we need to have a tight strategy to do that, because we don't have the money they have. At the same time, we should not hide what our policy positions are. If it is true strategy, it's true strategy. But if it is a policy position that is controversial, then we need to have deeper conversations. So I think it's a process. And I say some of this in hopes that you will maybe understand that the process will take some time and work, but it's going to be worth it. And you're not alone. This is not the first time I heard that comment, and it sometimes happens in other states. But I'll tell you that the prouder we are, the more transparent we are, the better we are, and the more effective we are as an organization, the happier people are within our organization. So I hope that makes sense. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you.
Dawn, can you just clarify the date, you or Lula? Kate in Arizona is saying that she thought she saw an email that said August 30th. So I just wanted to clarify what the proper date is for everyone.
The nominations are due to us by September 15, and then we will reach out back to you guys with the approval process by October 1st.
Great.
I'm not sure what August 30th date is. It might be a typo.
Thank you, Lula, and thanks, Kate. That's a good question. If you have it ready by August 30th, great, send it in, because we have approximately 600 people volunteering on the legislative action committees. So all of the paperwork that goes along with that to get everybody in place and approved by October 1st is not easy. So if you have it done, send it. Don't wait for the deadline.
Dawn, there's another question, and this may be for Lula. Where can we find the term list for our current LAC?
I'll be glad to provide that to you if you tell me what your state is.
Great question.
Dawn, this is Kate. So you had talked about it briefly. We always have, this year we actually have a great turnout. A lot of people applied, but we're upside down 2 people. So like,
what does that mean? What does upside down 2 people
upside
mean?
down mean we have more than majority for managers.
Okay.
So I've been trying to recruit some business partner or homeowner leader to offset the 2. But if we can't find the 2, the hard part for the LAC delegates is to decide who to remove. And that's always a big political nightmare, because heaven forbid any of them want to remove somebody who's a potential client. So right now I don't want to put anybody in that position, and I'm trying to recruit maybe 2 business partners or a business partner homeowner, because that's all we need to do is to balance it, and that'll put us right at 20.
Right.
So that's always a touchy subject though. how, if we can't get anywhere with that, what is our recourse?
So then I'd be happy to talk offline with you,
Okay.
because especially when it comes to managers on this, we need to engage managers, right? They are really important piece. Everyone is an important piece of this, but we really need to engage managers because they are able to engage their associations for grassroots engagement. And they also are able to tell the story to legislators really, really well. So sometimes we have advisory committees or councils that we also can engage, or we can have non-voting members as well, that we can try to figure out how to have the non-voting members still engaged in the process. I think that's the important part.
Okay.
The purpose of the guidelines are to address issues that would make us a less than effective committee, right? So if, for example, and this is random, let's just say we have pool supply companies, pool companies, and the majority of the business part, say we had 12 people who were pool supply companies, and they all joined the Legislative Action Committee because there was some bill out there that said they had to start using this chemical and it was going to be really expensive for them. So they all joined our LAC to try to get that bill passed so that it would help them. We want to make sure that that type of thing doesn't happen. It's never happened. It was a total hypothetical example, but that's why we make sure that we have that balance. We also don't want the issues and the representation. Here's a perfect example, Kate. So in California and in Arizona, there are manager-only organizations. And we are not a manager-only organization. We represent the interests of the entire community association housing model. So if we only had managers, management companies on our Legislative Action Committee, or it was an overwhelming majority, then that we wouldn't be able to proceed with our public policy for all of our community, our CAI members and all of community association interests with that imbalance. So we just watch for it. If there's a circumstance where, you know what, the LAC is running and operating really well, really effectively, and we have two more of this group than that group, but it's a very high functioning Legislative Action Committee, that whole Legislative Action Committee may be able to appeal the process and vote and say, you know what, we really want all of these people. Here's why, here's our demonstrated success. And we will we'll review that and make a determination. So the guidelines are intended to be structured so that we have a super awesome committee, not to be restrictive. So with that spirit, that's how we can work within the structure as long as we're preserving the integrity of the committee. Make sense?
Sounds good.
Okay, awesome. Good question. Thank you. There are some Legislative Action Committee resources. There is the appointment memo. This gives you kind of an outline of the process for appointing the delegates. So take a look at that. A couple of other resources: contact the LAC chair and ask them to include you on the communication distribution list for all of their conversations, all of their activity. Oftentimes, Legislative Action Committees are, focused on some very technical legal issues. And I know when I first started as a chapter executive director, it was hard to follow the conversation. I didn't know what they were talking about. And I say this all the time, chapter executive directors, if you don't know what the Legislative Action Committee members are talking about when they're having conversations about things, and if you don't know what they're talking about when they are writing calls to action or articles for your newsletter, you need to ask them to clarify. Ask them questions, because if you don't understand it, that means our members don't understand it either. And oftentimes, like I said, a lot of these issues are very legal and very and can be complicated issues and nuanced as well. But if you don't ask the questions, then you're not able to share that information effectively with our members. I've worked with our legislative action committees for many years, and I used to feel like I was asking some really stupid questions. But now I know asking those questions just made our communication to members that much better. So be included on those communications and ask questions when you need to ask questions. And take a look at the LAC operational guidelines. These guidelines are coming up and 10 years old. They haven't been updated in 10 years. We've been looking at making some suggested changes to them, but didn't want to do so until after this 10-year term limit kind of came up. So we will be over the next term as LACs are working within the guidelines now. We'll start making some changes just to update, not to end the term limits. That's not going to happen, but just to make some updates and to one of the areas of focus that we'll be looking at is finding ways to strengthen opportunities for the chapter and the Legislative Action Committee to work together. Are there any questions? So a couple of resources that I think, and we have a lot of resources for legislative action committees and for our chapters. One thing that's not here that I should have added on here, and I will send to you, or maybe Emily or Kelly will send to you. The legislative action committees, they are guided by CAI's public policies. We have about 45 public policies on a variety of topics: reserves, board member training, manager licensing, Fair Housing Act, amending documents, short-term rentals, a variety of issues. And our policy positions on those issues are stated in our public policies. And the legislative action committees must comply with those public policies. So if there's a bill that comes out and the legislative action committee wants to take a position that is not consistent with CAI's public policies, they can't. If there is a reason that they need to take that position, they think because politically they can't oppose it, or they need to support it because otherwise there will be even worse legislation. If there are circumstances, the only way around that for the LAC to be able to take a position different than CAI's policy position is for that legislative action committee to ask the Government and Public Affairs Committee for an exception. And that exception needs to be made in writing to the CAI Government and Public Affairs Committee. So that's super important, and super important for chapter executive directors to know as well, so that when you're listening to their calls, if you know CAI does not support initiating manager licensing, then it'll be helpful for you to be able to remind the legislative action committees of that. By the way, the legislative action committees, Phoebe Nesseth, my colleague, and I, we split those legislative action committees and each liaise with half of them. So we try to be on as many calls and in as many meetings as possible with our legislative action committees. But if we're not there and you hear something that maybe should be brought to our attention, we would appreciate you bringing it to our attention. So that's one resource. Another resource is we have a lot of tools and resources on our webpage. The best place to find information is our kind of high-level landing page, which is caionline.org/advocacy. There are tracking reports, our public policies, our priority issues, white papers associated with our priority issues, and more. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at CAI Advocacy. We have a Government and Public Affairs blog that is strictly focused on policy issues, policy issues and legal issues. And we post about once a week. I said this at our last meeting, was at the Chapter Executive Director Training Program and President-elect Training Program. Chapter Executive Directors, feel free to go to that blog, take a blog post, print it in your newsletter, or use it on your website, use it as one of your communication tools. It's really good content and should be repurposed as you'd like to. We also have our advocacy system. where we can connect members with their legislator. And we support our legislative action committees by sending out these calls to action to engage our members, to contact legislators and let them know how we feel about specific bills or even specific, just about the community association housing model. So this is really powerful. We pay for this. It's something that our chapters, most of our legislative action committees use. And if a legislative action committee comes to you, chapter exec, and says, hey, I need you to send something out to our members to let them know about this legislation and tell them to contact their legislators, you should call us because we have the system to be able to do it for you. And that's all I have. This is, again, what's really important about this process is that everyone's communicating with everyone, that the board has a role in appointing the best people they can to the legislative action committees, and that the legislative action committees and chapter executive directors are working together regularly, talking about the issues that are important to our members so that we can be the best advocates we can be for our members, and we can deliver that promise that we've promised to our members. We will advocate for policies that protect you, our members. We need to be able to deliver that promise, and we can't do it unless we're all working together.
If you have any questions, please contact a member of the Chapter Relations team or emails chapterlearning@caionline.org.